As an ex-Christian, this is one of the most embarrassing verses in the whole Bible. This is what is known as the mustard seed dilemma. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like that of a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed on the face of the earth. The smallest seeds on earth are orchid seeds. That means the biblical Jesus got it wrong. Christianity has to be false.
So it automatically follows that Christianity is false? Not quite. Here's the thing. That argument only really holds if Christ is trying to make a universal botanical scientific claim. I think a strong case can be made that he's not doing that. The genre in which Jesus is communicating to his audience actually employs multiple kinds of language. We've got parabolic language used and employed by the parables. And this is language that does not aim to be precise, direct, and accurate. In fact, within the context and scope of first century Judeo-Israel, many rabbis would speak and teach using cryptic stories, cryptic speech that makes the student or the person who hears the parable think on a metaphorical level as well as a physical or figurative or literal level. The point is that this is not clean, direct language. And this type of language already does not heighten the chances of someone trying to make a universal direct scientific claim. The other aspect of this is that Jesus employs phenomenological language, and I'm going to get into that, what that is. I say that he's using parabolic language because we see that what's actually being spoken about is the kingdom of God being likened to a seed, starting out super small, being put into a context or place where it's small among other things, but has the potential and ability to grow larger than the other things. And so there are various layers of thought, small start, but a great result. And these are the aspects about this kingdom that the parable causes us to cast our thoughts and meditate on. The language is not trying to be precise. The language is trying to communicate a journey, parts, and role players in a context and using a phenomena that his audience of the time would have understood. And this is where we get into phenomenological language. Phenomenological language is not language that is trying to be precise. Phenomenological language is appealing to a known natural phenomenon, cultural phenomenon, linguistic phenomenon of the person who is being communicated to. For example, if I say I was stuck in traffic forever, or oh, I drove forever to get here, that's a linguistic phenomenon. I'm using a language that is within our scope, within the dynamic of our language operates today. It's a modern phenomenon of language that I don't have to use a literal word. I can figuratively communicate something without you questioning it. It makes sense to you. You grasp it. You relate to it. It's a phenomenon of our time. If I say the sun rises and sets, that's me using phenomenological language. I'm appealing to something that you experience as the person receiving communication from me. You experience the sun rising and setting. I'm not trying to be biologically, I'm not trying to be scientifically precise. And I can say this because the sun doesn't actually rise or set. The sun literally stands still and everything else orbits it. But you don't challenge my use of the language of how the sun behaves because you experience a rising and a setting. So I appeal to the phenomena that is already relevant to you, that is common to your experience. That is phenomenological language. I don't expect you to actually investigate the language I'm using. I expect that it will already be intelligible to you. Intelligible means it is something that makes sense to you. You don't get confused by what I'm saying. There are all kinds of phenomena: cultural phenomena, linguistic phenomena, natural phenomena, or even spiritual phenomena, right? For example, within the Jewish context, someone saying that my life or my soul goes into the pit. That wouldn't universally be understood by everyone, but within a certain context, a certain culture, that is a spiritual phenomena, that going into the pit means that you are going to death, into the underworld, into Sheol. No one stops and goes, what do you mean by that? Not within the Jewish context. The understanding is already there. It is a phenomenon known to the people. And by the way, it's clear that Christ is employing parabolic language and phenomenology or phenomenological language to his audience. Why is that important? Because it lessens the likelihood that Christ is using the language he's using in a universal scientific botanical claim. He's not trying to be technically precise with his language. Now, there's a part of King Dawa's argument that at the end of the day is still inaccurate, therefore he still can't be God, therefore Christianity false. Cool, I get that, right? It's a possibility. I'm not going to flat out deny that that could still stand. But if Christ is not making the claim in the first place, then you have to prove why him saying something that is not actually his claim, why that follows that he must have been wrong about something he was not trying to address in the first place. The irony of this argument is that King Dawa here, he actually has a heavier burden of proof. The onus is on him to show why Christ must either be sloppy in his facts or is making a scientific claim and getting it wrong and teaching false botany. The irony is that you have the higher burden of proof than I do. I just have to look at the context clues. But let's go into what's actually being said and why it's not a problem for me. Now, the English does a couple of things that allows assumptions to be made and I guess would kind of make one conclude that Christ is making a large claim about botany and all botanical seeds, but he's getting it wrong. I get that. However, based on what I just explained about the genre that Christ is using, now when you couple that with the Greek, we find out something very interesting. Okay, so contextually, Christ is saying that man sows the seed in a field, right? He uses the word spermaton, right, which is going to be a word in Greek derivative from the word sperma, which speaks about seed. And lexically, this usually either meant offspring or sown seed, not any kind of seed that is typically handled and sown. Now, I'm not saying that that must be the meaning, but that's one of the possible meanings. The rest of the context will tell us something interesting, right? And when we move along, we see it sown in a field, not a garden. It's not a typical garden plant. It's sown in a field. Okay, so that's going to support cultivation, agricultural use. And then we see that it grows larger than all the other garden plants. But note what's happening there. Christ is now creating a category, garden plants. Now in English, we can be like, yeah, but you could put an orchid in your garden. Cool, get that, right? But actually, in the Greek, the word that's being used there is lakanon. And lakanon, even in the typical usage within the Bible, is going to refer to edible, cultivated agricultural crops. Crops for food, vegetables, and herbs. That is what lakanon is. And so I must ask the question, King Dawa, are orchids lakana or lakanon? Ask any first century Jew or Israelite, the answer will be no. This heightens the plausibility and the likelihood that Christ already is not making a claim about seeds of every kind. He is actually making a claim about seeds within a specific category. Edible vegetables cultivated as per the typical farmers of first century Judea or Israel. And again, you don't plant orchids in a field. That was not a common typical practice in first century Judea. Orchids were not very easy to handle in the first century. In fact, yes, their smallness made it even more of a challenge. An orchid is less than a millimeter, half a millimeter to be precise. You know how hard it is to handle as a farmer in first century Judea. Not only that, they have a very meticulous cultivating process or germination process. They have to bond to a fungus. Now, why would Christ be using something like this in a parable, in a phenomenological way? Because think about that. Imagine for a second that you know nothing about Jewish slavery or servitude and the debt repayment system, right? Let's assume that you are someone who has no grasp of the Bible. And then on top of that, your only real reference for slavery is the transatlantic slave trade, where you had a white master and a black slave, right? And it's a cotton plantation, right? Just put yourself in that scenario. And Jesus tells you this parable that the king wants to settle accounts, right? This is the parable of the unforgiving slave. That the king wants to settle accounts. Goes to a slave, says, you owe me. And the slave says, Master, please be patient with me, because the king wants his money. He wants to be paid up. And the slave says, Master, please just be patient with me. I will pay you back everything. And the king takes pity on the slave and just cancels the debt. Fine, you owe me nothing. You're good. You are good. And that slave goes to another slave and says, pay me what you owe me, chokes the person, throws that person in jail. Now, me, having no context, I start poking holes in this parable immediately. I go, since when does the master lend the slave money? That slavery doesn't work like that. The slave doesn't even own anything. The slave doesn't have property. What? How does it? Wait, the master lets the slave go free? No, the master would auction the slave off. Wait, how can one slave own another slave? And then the other slave owes that slave money. What? That's not how slavery works. So this is the point, right? Parables and the strength and the effectiveness of parables is reliant on the audience already understanding certain cultural phenomenon. Not technically precise language, but rather language that appeals to the understanding of the audience. The audience already has to understand the dynamics of the economics and the servitude of the time for his parable to even make sense, especially when we look at that parable being told of the unforgiving servant. So take that same logic and apply it into the parable of the person planting the seed, the mustard seed. The audience has to already have a reference, right? And that is true, that in Judea, first century Israel, the Jews already consider the mustard seed it's a representation of the tiniest food crop. So Christ is already establishing a category of crop, a category of seed, appealing to the audience's understanding of what the smallest possible seed is. And that heightens the plausibility, right? That actually within his intended communication, within his category, Christ's statement that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, it is actually true. It's true within that intent. It's true within that communication. It's true within that statement. Just like me saying the sun sets and rises is not technically false. It's true according to your phenomenon. That is what we experience. There's no error there. It's only going to be an error when you take something, a statement I make, not as a scientific statement, but you try and import scientific rules into it. Then I'm in error. But who does that, right? And King Dawa, I'd love to challenge you. I'd love to challenge you on this. If you're going to hold my Bible to those standards, please hold your Quran to that standard. If you're trying to say that God can't use phenomenological language, otherwise he's in error, then you need to explain why God in your Quran says that the sun sets in a muddy spring. That's phenomenological language, by the way. But let's get into it, right? Let's say that King Dawa grants me that Jesus is speaking about only food, agricultural seeds, but he's still making an erroneous statement. That statement would have to actually be Jesus saying, I'm talking about all seeds of every category across the entire world, right? And when we come to the Greek, epites ges. Epites ges could be translated in the English as of all the earth, but ge or ges is context dependent. We find in Mark 6 and in Mark 8 that the same word is used, and yet it does not mean earth. In one instance, ge or ges means simply soil, ground. In another instance, it just means a portion of land. So context will determine how plausibly we can take a certain intent or statement from the speaker. For example, if we go to Mark chapter 6 from verse 47, right, where we see that the disciples are on a boat in the ocean, and it says, and Jesus was on land alone. The same Greek is employed, ge or ges. So why do we not translate that as earth, right? Why? Because we culturally understand and contextually understand that Mark's not trying to tell us that Jesus was alone on the earth. He's not the only person present on the actual earth. He's the only person present on that piece of land. If ge or ges doesn't just have to refer to the whole earth, but could just mean soil, ground, piece of local or regionalized land, then surely context could deliver the same thing for us in Mark chapter 4. We can even go to Mark chapter 8, where the 5,000 are being fed. Jesus looks at the loaves of bread and the fish, and he instructs the crowd to sit down on the ground. The same word is employed there as well. Ges, earth, right? Jesus doesn't say sit on the entire planet. He's saying, guys, sit on the ground. We're going to start feeding and distributing food. And if we can see that in the parable, Jesus is saying, it's the smallest of all seeds within the cultural, agricultural sector, it doesn't have to mean earth. it could mean, right, because of the parabolic genre and the phenomenological genre, it could just plausibly mean of all the region. Because it's the region of Judea that would have to understand his parable. It has to fall within the realm of understanding of an audience, understanding that this is the smallest agricultural cultivated seed. And that's only going to be true for Judea in the first century. So when he says it's the smallest of all seeds of the earth, or guess, could just mean plausibly the smallest of all seeds in the land. This is how I'm showing that Jesus does not necessarily need to be making a universal botanical scientific claim about every single category of seed across the entire scope of the planet. I think that what's more plausible is that Christ is using parabolic language, appealing to specific people's understanding, relying on them already grasping the concepts he's speaking about, and localizing and exclusively restricting that to a specific region. And so it's more plausible that Christ is saying that the mustard seed is the smallest of all crops, vegetable crops, lakana, in the region. And the burden of proof is on you to show why that's less plausible. Because my interpretation respects genre, context, audience, conventions of the Greek, and typical biblical usages. It allows for the lexical range, the semantic range of the word to apply based on context, whereas yours relies on appealing to a hard English translation and importing modern assumptions about phenomenological language onto Jesus. And if you're going to hold hard to that, hold the same standard with your Quran, King Dawa. I'd love to see that. I would love to see that. Christ is King.